there is an injunction on the Title IX rule, that doesn't mean that these protections don't exist at all in the states or the schools that have an injunction. What an injunction means is that it stops the Department of Education from enforcing the Title IX rule.
Hello, Shiwali. How are you?
Good, how are you?
Good. Thanks so much for joining us. And before we get started, I just want to tell everybody that we are going to be talking about sexual assault in Title IX. So there is a content warning with this IG Live. But thank you again so much for taking the time to join us. And could you share a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, of course. So thank you so much for having me. I am thrilled to be part of this conversation. As you all know, as Tracy said, I serve on the board of Callisto, and I work at the National Women's Law Center. I'm the Senior Director of Safe and Inclusive Schools. And I really got into this work advocating for the rights of students, for the rights of student survivors when I was a student myself, when I was in college, years before I even knew about Title IX and how it requires schools to address sexual assault on campus. And we were then dealing with the same issues that students are dealing with today. Survivors being punished after coming forward, survivors not having access to adequate supportive measures on campus. There being a lot of, I guess, lack of education around resources. And then I decided, I want to go to law school, but before I went to law school, I worked at a local rape crisis center. I did a lot of work with students, did lots of outreach around issues of sexual violence and dating violence, and then ended up at law school at American University in DC, where I currently live, or I'm right outside of DC. And I have been at the Law Center for about 6 years now, and feel really grateful that I get to do this work every day.
That's so great. So thank you again so much for being here. We have prepared some questions, but also want to make sure that we have time for those people tuning in. So for any audience members, if you have a question, there's a little question mark bubble that you can put your questions in. We also have somebody moderating the chat, and we'll try to make time for those at the end. Again, if you're just joining us live, I'm Tracy DiTomasi, the CEO of Callisto, and we have Shiwali Patel, civil rights attorney and Title IX expert, joining us today. So I know we've done a previous IG Live about this, but can you give us a quick overview of the changes that were included in the new Title IX guidelines that were released in the spring?
Sure. So these changes are significant. They actually just went into effect on August 1st, so about a week, a little over a week ago. And they do a number of things. They clarify that LGBTQI plus students have protections from sex discrimination in the Title IX regulations. So the regulations now make clear that discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender identity, sex characteristics, including intersex traits, is prohibited. These aren't new protections under Title IX. I want to be clear about that, but this is the first time that the rule itself has made that clear. It's also clarified that students who are trans, non-binary, should be able to access restrooms and locker rooms consistent with their gender identity. The rule also clarifies the types of accommodations and supports that schools need to provide to pregnant and parenting students. And discrimination based on pregnancy and related medical conditions is quite broad. It also includes students who terminate their pregnancy, so maybe, getting an abortion. So these clarifications around accommodations also exist for those students. And then lastly, the rule reverses much of what the Trump administration, under former Secretary Betsy DeVos's leadership, did under Title IX when in 2020 they significantly weakened schools' responsibilities to respond to sexual assault, right? The types of changes they made then just further push sexual violence under the rug by setting a higher standard for what schools are allowed to investigate under Title IX, by creating limits on what they have to investigate based on the location of the assault, by imposing hostile and unfair grievance procedures on student survivors when students complaining of any other type of misconduct wouldn't have to undergo hostile procedures like direct live cross-examination. And so the rule really restores fairness, and it restores more accountability for schools when it comes to responding to sexual assault against students.
Thank you so much for taking the time to explain all of that. And again, if you're just joining us live, I'm Tracy DiTomasi, the CEO of Costo, and we have Shiwali Patel, civil rights attorney and Title IX expert, joining us today. So the next question that I have for you, of all the new news of the lawsuits, has been really overwhelming and confusing, and I
Mhm.
don't think that anybody fully understands it. But can you help break down the basics of what the lawsuits involved and where things are at now, especially as we go into the fall semester?
Yeah, it is quite confusing. And, it's only going to be confusing because things may change with these lawsuits. So the short of it is that there are about, I think, 9 lawsuits that were filed by 26 states and some individuals as well as organizations who have sued the Biden administration in an attempt to stop the Title IX rule from going into effect. And they have been successful in getting a preliminary injunction or an injunction to basically temporarily stop enforcement of the rule in those states and in quite a few schools, K-12 schools, and colleges and universities throughout the country. These are schools of members of some associations who have sued to stop the rule, or there are schools of students of members of an organization, Moms for Liberty, that also sued to stop the rule. What's important to know is that even if there is an injunction, it's temporary. It could be reversed by a higher court as these cases make their way up for appeals, for review. The Department of Justice is defending the rule, and they have asked the higher courts to kind of stop part of the injunction. And ultimately, they're going to, continue to defend the Biden rule as being lawful. So things could change any moment. And it's also important to know that when there is an injunction on the Title IX rule, that doesn't mean that these protections don't exist at all in the states or the schools that have an injunction. What an injunction means is that it stops the Department of Education from enforcing the Title IX rule. So schools can still go above and beyond, and they can still change their policies. They can still choose to implement policies that are protective of students, that ensure that schools are safe and affirming and welcoming environments, because the injunction just ties the hands of the Department of Ed from investigating a school that may violate the regulations. The other thing that's important to know, and I know this is quite complicated, is that the Title IX regulations are not the only source of law that speaks to what Title IX protects. So Title IX at its core is only 37 words long, but it is so broad in how it protects students from sex discrimination, including sexual assault. And there are courts, there are a number of higher courts, appellate courts that have spoken to this issue of Title IX and who it protects. So for example, some of these states that have an injunction include South Carolina, Virginia, West Virginia, and they're in the Fourth Circuit. That means that they're in states that have to comply with the Fourth Circuit, the Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit, that has already said for trans and non-binary students, schools have to allow them to access restrooms consistent with their gender identity, or they'd be violating Title IX. So even if the Department of Ed can't enforce the rule around access to restrooms and locker rooms, those schools in those states still have to comply with the law, which does require that. So there is that kind of level of nuance there. With respect to sexual assault, unfortunately, where there is an injunction, that means that because the Biden administration cannot enforce the 2024 regulations as to protections against sexual harassment, including sexual assault, the Trump rules from 2020 then apply in those schools, at those schools where there is an injunction. So, I kind of briefly mentioned earlier how the 2020 rule was less protective of sexual assault. That is true. However, there are ways that schools can still go above and beyond what the Trump rule allowed. And, the National Women's Law Center has created some resources to kind of list out those ways, and I think ways that students who are interested could advocate with their schools to still be more protective of survivors.
That's really a lot of information, and thank you for sharing it all, because it is so confusing. And I think that survivors don't really always know where to turn. So if you've just joined us again, I have Shiwali Patel, civil rights attorney and Title IX expert, joining us today. We're talking about sexual assault and Title IX. If you have any questions for Shiwali, please make sure to put them in the little question bubble on the bottom or put them in the chat, and we've got somebody moderating that we can pull them. So another question that I have for you, Shiwali, is that with things being in a bit of a limbo in some ways right now, what protection can survivors of sexual assault expect in the fall?
So part of it depends on it depends on where they're at, right? What school they're at, what state they're at. So earlier I mentioned that in addition to these 26 states that have an injunction, there are a lot of colleges outside of those states that may have an injunction because they include some of their students are members of two organizations, either Female Athletes United, I'm looking at the list right now, or Young America's Foundation. And the Department of Education has a list of those institutions. So for those institutions, and again, the schools in those 26 states, they would apply the Trump rule would be in effect. But again, even if the Trump rule would dictate the school's responsibilities when it comes to campus sexual assault, it doesn't mean that they can't go above and beyond. So for example, the Trump rule has a narrower definition of sexual harassment, right? It requires a higher level of severity in order for the school to have to investigate it. It sets limits on the location so that for a lot of off-campus conduct, not all, but it might not require or allow an investigation under a Title IX policy, and imposes hostile grievance procedures. But with the Trump rule, there could still be, and I know this is confusing, but this is just the way the rule sets it up, non-Title IX sexual harassment policies, like schools can still have broader policies to address harassment, including sexual assault, that doesn't kind of meet this higher standard that the Trump administration's rules have created. The National Women's Law Center, again, has created a resource to really identify all those places where we could push schools to still do more. And so outside of Title IX, there are also state laws. So some of these schools are in states that, by state law, again, not Title IX, but their own state law protections, they require schools to do more to protect student survivors. So I think that's important to know about, what state are you in and do they have additional legal protections? And then, of course, outside of the law, schools can always choose to have protected policies, which they should be having, to make sure that every student feels safe on campus.
That's all super helpful. Because again, I'm going to keep saying it. It is super confusing for all of this, and even me, who I've been following it and learning about it, and talked to several attorneys, and it's still confusing as to where the protections are at. We did have a question submitted, and again, if people that are just joining us, feel free to submit questions for Shiwali in the little question bubble or in the comments. But we did have a question submitted, and that was, what can organizers and student activists do in one of these states like Arkansas to pressure their university or state government to implement the new guidance?
Yeah, so it depends. Again, Arkansas is one of those states that has an injunction, where the state is, and whether or not they're in a circuit that has these additional protections. So I think part of it is, when it comes to state level advocacy, there are organizations that are doing work to push states to implement laws, to work with state legislators who care about these issues, to have better protections at the state level. I think that's always necessary and important to do. And again, to the extent that, for these schools in Arkansas where the Trump rule would apply, like, there are ways that schools can and should still do more. So they shouldn't just say, oh, well, now there's an injunction, we can't have policies that allow us to address sexual assault that occurs outside of an education program activity, even if the survivor has to be in class with their assailant. We can't do anything, or, we can't do anything because this isn't considered severe enough, or, these students have to now all only go through direct live cross-examination for anyone who's reported harassment. There are ways to still push the school and show how well they could still have broader policies, because the Trump rule does allow schools to address other, it's not required. They don't require schools to address more sexual harassment, but they allow it. And so schools should do it. And we have those resources that I'm happy to share with Callisto to share with you all on those places where, we can advocate and push for schools to do more. Um, and in terms of other protections, I think it's important to know for the pregnant parenting student protections that these are clarifications. It's not that these rights don't exist without the Title IX regulations, and the same for LGBTQI plus protections. I think it's important to know what state you're in and whether or not the state itself, unfortunately, might have some hostile laws, because a lot of those have emerged, specifically targeting trans, non-binary, intersex students. So it's just being aware of, what are the state protections, or, what might the state law say about these issues or require.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I know you kind of just mentioned this, but where can people go to get more info about this as they are exploring their options under Title IX?
Yeah, we have a lot of information at the Law Center. We are right now putting together a very detailed fact sheet explainer that goes into the details of all the different ways that the Biden administration addresses protections against sex-based harassment, including sexual assault, how it differs from the Trump rule. We have other resources that I mentioned a few times about how you can push schools to do more, even if they have to comply with the Trump rule. There are other organizations like GLSEN that tracks what are state protections for LGBTQI plus students and how do they vary. And so there are organizations that are tracking on a state to state level, what the protections are. And then there are other organizations, ours included, that are, have resources, and we're continuing to develop more to really go into the weeds on this Title IX rule, because the rule itself is quite massive. Like, with the preamble language, it's several hundred pages long. So we dove through it, and we pulled out all the relevant information to be as helpful as possible in breaking down what the changes are.
That's great. And, one of the reasons that Callisto exists is because these systems are so confusing, and they don't help a lot of survivors, and they're often really difficult to navigate. So I'm wondering if you can just kind of say why you think that resources, particularly like Callisto and our matching system, are so important, particularly with the changing regulations with every administration now and in the future.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, these regulatory changes, like, ultimately what they do when it comes to sexual assault is they require schools to do more in response to it. So having ways to ensure that that students are aware of what the resources are, whether, they could get information from Callisto about what would happen if they were to report before they're ready to actually make a formal report. That is so important. As you all know very well, for a lot of student survivors, they're unsure about whether or not they want to pursue the formal process. And so preserving that survivor autonomy is so important, while allowing survivors to have access to resources to be able to put information from what happened that they may later decide to put into a formal complaint, should they choose to pursue that route, is so critical. And there is some recognition in the Title IX role of protecting survivor autonomy while ensuring access to supportive measures and other resources. Now this rule clarifies that schools can have confidential resources and confidential ways of reporting that wouldn't trigger an investigation. So again, I think Callisto's like vault and the way of just being able to preserve information as a survivor has it, so that it's as fresh, as possible, that if they later decide that they want to report it formally, I think could only enable them to make, a better and stronger decision if that is the avenue they want to pursue.
Thank you for sharing all of that. We did get a question in the chat. And so if anybody else has any questions, feel free to add them. But the question that we got is, what potential changes could occur if the injunctions can be overturned by higher courts? And in what ways can this impact schools and students?
Yeah, so if an injunction is overturned, that means then the rule goes into effect. And so schools shouldn't expect there to be a grace period for which they have, to come into compliance. So what we're saying is that they need to start now. They should start, if they can implement the rule, like they could go above and beyond. These injunctions, again, they don't prohibit or stop schools from implementing them. The injunctions are about stopping the Department of Ed from enforcing its rule. So they should still already be working towards compliance, because if these injunctions are overturned, which could happen easily, they are being appealed, they're going to be reviewed by a higher court, then the schools are going to have to come into compliance. And that means all the protections that come with the Title IX rule are protections that the schools have to comply with.
Do we have an idea of the timeline of those decisions?
That is a great question. We don't know. It's hard to say when these decisions are going to come out. The preliminary injunctions have come out quickly because those are typically more kind of immediate in the type of relief that the plaintiffs are, the people who brought the complaint, are seeking. So those are also making its way up through the higher court review, through appeals. And then there are also requests by the Department of Justice, they're like the attorneys for the government, that are asking courts to partially stay an injunction. So what a stay means is that it kind of puts the injunction on hold, so basically it's not in effect. And a partial stay is for just part of the injunction to be stayed. So like part of it to be in effect and part of it to not. So that means the schools would have to comply with some parts of the rule. And if that happens, that could impact the protections around sexual assault, because most of these lawsuits did not challenge the provisions around grievance procedures for like the types of investigations, for example, schools have to apply for sexual assault. They all challenge the protections for LGBTQI plus students. And even though they didn't challenge some of these grievance procedures around sexual assault complaints, the courts that granted the injunction said the injunction applies for the entire rule. So DOJ in some of these cases has been requesting courts to just narrow that injunction. And so we could get a decision there as well. It's hard to say.
All of these things are just so frustrating. Um, so we have about 5 minutes left. And again, thank you so much for joining us. This has all been super helpful. Before we wrap this up, is there anything else that we haven't asked you, but you think would be helpful for survivors to know about these lawsuits or Title IX in general?
Yeah, I just want to underscore that these injunctions do not mean that Title IX protections don't exist. Students should know that they do have rights under Title IX. An injunction does not take away those rights. So anyone who's saying otherwise is just wrong. And that even with an injunction in place, it doesn't mean that schools are not allowed to treat sexual harassment seriously, that they don't have responsibilities to address it, and that it doesn't mean that they can't go above and beyond. So they should absolutely still be pressured to do as much as they can to protect survivors and to ensure that their campuses are safe for everyone.
I think that's so important that schools can choose to go above and beyond. And if they're not, that's on the school. And so we need to continue to pressure them to do that. Just as a reminder to everybody who joined us, thank you so much. We are going to be sharing a recording of this live to our account, so you can follow us at Callisto or check back on our website at projectcallisto.org. It will be listed there too. If you are a current student who are looking to get more involved in what we do here at Callisto, we encourage you to consider applying to our ambassador program, which can be found on our website at projectcallisto.org/campus, or you can click the Become an Ambassador button in our bio. And if you click that button as well, you'll find a lot of different resources that we have. And Shiwali has made her contact information available as well. So Shiwali, if you want to share your email address for people to reach out to you, that'd be great.
Sure. It's spatel@nwlc.org.
Yeah.
So SPATEL@nwlc.org.
And
And thank you, Tracy. Sorry.
yeah, no, of
Thank you for
course.
inviting me to speak.
No, we are really excited to have your support as a board member, as a partner, and I'm assuming that people can continue to follow along this journey as things continue to change at nwlc.org, and we will probably have you back or other attorneys back talking about this as things change as well. So thank you again so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you. and I'm
Yeah.
happy to come back to talk about this anytime.
Great. Thanks so much for joining us, everyone. Bye.
Bye.